The Texas sun beat down on the dusty road outside Prairie View Baptist Church, and Emma Hartley stood in the shadows of the vestibule, her white wedding dress catching the light like a beacon of contradiction. At 28 years old, with curves that had been the subject of small-town whispers for over a decade, she'd somehow become a bride. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her mother had cried that morning, tears of joy, she claimed, though Emma suspected they were tears of disbelief. After all, this was supposed to be the impossible thing. The girl who'd grown up in Riverside, Texas, the girl who cooked the best biscuits and gravy in 3 counties, the girl whose laughter could light up a room, that girl wasn't supposed to get married. That girl was supposed to be grateful for friendship, for being included in gatherings, for having a purpose in other people's lives. But then Marcus Webb had arrived at the farmer's market 6 months ago, and everything changed. Marcus Webb wasn't a man impressed by conventional beauty. He was a rancher, weathered by years of sun and work, with hands that could gentle a wild horse and a gaze that seemed to see straight through the armor of self-doubt Emma wore like a second skin. He'd tasted her cornbread at the market, bought 3 loaves, and returned the next week asking for more. That simple transaction had somehow become the beginning of everything. What happened next was something Emma had stopped believing in. Someone choosing her. Not her usefulness, not her cooking, her. But before the joy of that moment, there had been years of something else entirely. Years of watching other girls get asked to dances. Years of being the friend, the confidant, the one everyone came to when they needed advice, but never when they needed a date. Years of believing that her body, soft, round, undeniably large, made her invisible to men who might love her. And standing here now, in her grandmother's dress, altered and re-altered to fit her frame, Emma understood something profound. The greatest act of courage isn't always about changing yourself. Sometimes it's about finding someone brave enough to accept you as you are. This is the story of how one woman discovered that being chosen isn't about fitting someone else's ideals. It's about meeting someone whose ideals have finally evolved enough to include you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma Hartley had learned early that the world had very specific ideas about what she should be, and more importantly, what she shouldn't be. It started in 6th grade when Miss Caldwell, the school nurse, had pulled her aside and suggested, ever so gently, that perhaps Emma might want to consider portion control. She was 11 years old, with baby fat that hadn't yet decided whether to stay or go, and the casual cruelty of an adult's concern had planted a seed that would grow into something much larger than her body ever would. By high school, the seed had become a garden of shame. Emma watched her classmates transform into the kinds of girls boys wanted to date. They became lithe and graceful, their bodies objects of desire rather than subjects of pity. Emma's body, meanwhile, continued its own trajectory. Generous curves, round cheeks, the kind of softness that made her look perpetually younger than her actual age. Or so she'd been told by well-meaning relatives. The boys in her class had been kind in that particular way. Small towns could be kind. They included her in group activities. They laughed at her jokes. They treated her like a sister. Older sister, probably, given the physical differences. But the point was, she was safe. Safe meant invisible. Safe meant never having to worry about being wanted in a way that might complicate things. Emma's mother, Dorothy, had never quite known how to help. She'd tried various approaches over the years, diets delivered with love, exercise suggestions wrapped in encouragement, the occasional gentle comment about taking care of yourself. Dorothy herself was thin, elegant in the way women of her generation often were, and she carried the particular helplessness of a mother watching her daughter navigate a world that had very different standards for girls who looked like Emma. "You have such a pretty face." "Honey, Dorothy would say, which was code for if only the rest would cooperate. Emma's father, Robert, had taken a different approach. He loved his daughter fiercely and had little patience for the world's judgment. But even his love couldn't protect her from the simple truth that the world judged women by their appearance, and appearance was supposed to be a certain way. By the time Emma reached her 20s, she'd made a quiet peace with invisibility. She'd built a life around the things she could control: her cooking, her kindness, her willingness to show up for other people. She worked as a teacher's aide at Riverside Elementary School, where children didn't care what size their teachers were. They only cared if you were patient and kind. She volunteered at church, organized community events, and had become the go-to person for any gathering that needed food. Her reputation had crystallized into something both wonderful and suffocating. Emma Hartley was the girl who could cook. Emma Hartley was reliable. Emma Hartley was someone's best friend, someone's confidant, someone's comfortable presence. Emma Hartley was not someone anyone fell in love with. This wasn't bitterness speaking, at least not most of the time. It was observation based on lived experience. She'd watched enough weddings come and go, weddings where girls who'd ignored her in elementary school walked down the aisle in white dresses while their mothers cried. She'd been a bridesmaid 4 times. She'd never caught a bouquet, though not from lack of trying. It was one of the small humiliations of her life, the way the bride would always angle the throw away from her. As if even in the fantasy of flowers and symbols, Emma wasn't supposed to imagine herself as the central figure. Riverside, Texas, was a town of roughly 4,000 people, nestled in the rolling hills between Austin and San Antonio. It had the feel of a place that time had mostly forgotten. Tree-lined streets, a downtown with buildings that dated back to the 1920s, a strong sense of community that could be either wonderful or stifling, depending on your perspective. Emma's family had lived here for 3 generations. Her grandfather had been a banker. Her father had taken over the family's feed store, and Emma had grown up with roots so deep they sometimes felt like anchors. The advantage of this was security and belonging. The disadvantage was that everyone knew her, had watched her grow from an adorable, chubby child into something more complicated, and had formed opinions about her that were difficult to shake. Take Mrs. Patricia Henning, for instance. Patricia had been 2 years ahead of Emma in school and had blossomed into the kind of beautiful that opened doors. She'd moved back to Riverside 5 years ago with an equally beautiful husband, 2 perfect children, and a certainty about her place in the world that bordered on spiritual. Patricia would see Emma at the grocery store and offer compliments about her biscuits in the same tone one might use to congratulate someone on a successful surgery. Genuine appreciation mixed with undertones of, "Thank goodness I'm not you," or there was the situation with David Martinez, who'd moved to Riverside when Emma was 23. David was genuinely nice, smart, funny, reasonably attractive. He'd asked Emma to coffee exactly once, and she'd gone with butterflies in her stomach and hope in her chest. He'd spent the entire day talking about his ex-girlfriend, then had never called again. Emma had later learned through the small-town gossip network that he'd been looking for a connection, and had presumably found one elsewhere, with a woman who looked nothing like her. These small rejections had accumulated over the years like interest on a debt. Each one seemed to confirm what Emma had learned to believe about herself, that she was worth friendship, worth utility, worth affection, but not worth romance, not worth being chosen in that particular way, so she'd stopped expecting it. She'd stopped hoping. She'd turned her full attention to the things she could control, perfecting her recipes, being the best friend anyone could ask for, building a life that mattered, even if it never included romantic love. The Riverside Farmers Market happened every Saturday morning in the parking lot of the community center. It had started 10 years ago as a small gathering of local growers and crafters, and had grown into something that drew people from 3 counties over. Emma had been selling there for the past 4 years, setting up a small table under a white canopy where she sold baked goods, sourdough bread, cinnamon rolls, cornbread, biscuits, cookies, pies. Her inventory would sell out by noon on most Saturdays. People didn't just buy from her because the food was excellent, though it was. They bought because Emma's presence at the market had become part of the rhythm of the morning, like the smell of fresh flowers and the sound of children running between the vendor stalls. It was a warm morning in May when Marcus Webb appeared at her table. Emma noticed him first because he stood out. Not in an obvious way. He wasn't flashy or particularly striking, though he was reasonably attractive in that weathered outdoor way that Texas men sometimes achieved. What made him noticeable was his stillness. While other customers moved quickly through the market, sampling and comparing, Marcus stood in front of her table and studied her cornbread with the kind of focused attention most people reserved for fine art. "Is this fresh?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of Texas drawl that suggested he'd grown up rural. "Made it this morning at 5 a.m., Emma replied, offering her standard response with a smile that was professional but not overly enthusiastic. She'd learned not to invest too much hope in interactions with men, no matter how attentive they seemed. "How much?" $3 for the loaf. $5 if you want butter and honey on the side. He bought 3 loaves and the butter and honey package. He paid with cash and counted out the bills slowly, as if making sure the transaction was fair. Then he did something unexpected. He actually opened one of the loaves right there, tore off a piece, and tasted it. Emma watched him chew, her stomach doing something complicated. This was new. Most people trusted the reputations or bought on impulse, but they didn't conduct quality testing right in front of her. "This is exceptional," Marcus said, and he sounded genuinely surprised. "Did you make this yourself?" "I did." "You sell other things? Bread, biscuits, rolls, some pastries, pies if you order ahead. Whatever people want, really." Marcus nodded, as if he was considering something important. "What's your name?" "Emma. Emma Hartley. Marcus Webb. I run a cattle operation about 20 miles north of here." He paused, still holding the piece of cornbread. "I don't suppose you take custom orders?" "I do, actually. What are you thinking?" "I have ranch hands, 8 of them right now. They eat the same food every day, store-bought bread, canned vegetables, whatever I throw together. It's not terrible, but it's not particularly inspiring. I was wondering if you'd be interested in providing bread and basic sides a few times a week. I could pay you well." Emma's mind raced through the logistics. Extra income would be wonderful. She was saving toward a house of her own, something that felt increasingly possible with each passing year. But she also sensed something else in the interaction, the way he was looking at her, not like she was a service provider, but like he was genuinely interested. "I could do that," Emma heard herself say. $2 per loaf if you order a dozen at a time. I'd need to know by Thursday for the following week." "That works. Can I give you my number? You can text or call with what you can provide." So Emma had written down his number on a scrap of paper, and Marcus had left with his cornbread, and that had been the beginning of something, though Emma hadn't known it at the time. Over the following weeks, Marcus became a regular presence in Emma's life. He'd place orders for bread and sides, biscuits, cornbread, bean salads, coleslaw. Every week he'd pick them up on Saturday mornings, and he'd started standing at her table not just to collect his order, but to talk. He asked questions about her recipes, about how long she'd been cooking, about her family. "You ever think about doing this full-time?" he asked one Saturday, about a month into their arrangement. "Sometimes. But it's safer working at the school. Regular income, benefits, that sort of thing. Is safety what you actually want, or is it what you think you're supposed to want?" The question had caught Emma off guard. No one had ever asked her what she wanted in that way, presuming that she might want something other than security and stability. "I don't know," she admitted. "I suppose I haven't thought about it much." Marcus had smiled then, and it was the smile of someone who'd just decided something important. 4 months after they'd first met, Marcus had appeared at Emma's door on a Tuesday evening. She'd been surprised, They'd never met anywhere except the farmer's market and brief phone conversations about orders. Emma had opened the door to find him holding a bouquet of wildflowers that looked like he'd picked them himself from a roadside. And her heart had done something she'd trained it not to do for years. It had hoped. "Hi," he'd said, sounding slightly nervous, in a way that made him suddenly very human and very real. "I know I should have called first, but I was in town and I wanted to talk to you about something in person." Emma had invited him inside, offered him tea, which he'd accepted, and they'd sat in her small living room while afternoon light filtered through the windows, and Marcus had explained why he was there. "I like you," he'd said simply. "I know you probably think I'm a customer or a business contact or whatever, but that's not how I see you. I see someone who's talented, kind, interesting, and I'd like to get to know you better. I'd like to take you to dinner." Emma's first instinct had been to make a joke, to deflect, to offer him an easy out by suggesting that he was mistaken or that she wasn't what he thought she was. But something in his expression, something absolutely genuine and unguarded, had stopped her. "Why?" she'd asked instead. "Why me?" And Marcus had looked at her like the question confused him slightly. "Why wouldn't it be you?" he'd replied. "You're smart, you're talented, you're kind, you make people's lives better just by showing up. Why would I be interested in anyone else?" It wasn't the flowery language of romantic movies, it wasn't the grand gesture she might have imagined in her younger years. It was something more powerful, a man stating facts as he saw them, without apology or qualification. Emma had said yes to dinner. What followed over the next few months had been something genuinely astonishing to Emma. She was being courted. Marcus would pick her up on Friday nights and take her to dinner at the Italian restaurant in the next town over, or they'd pack a picnic and drive out to watch the sunset from a hilltop overlooking the ranch. He'd listen to her talk about her family, her dreams, the small disappointments and unexpected joys of her life. And he'd share his own stories, about growing up on his family's ranch, about the challenges of managing cattle operations, about the loneliness of building a life in rural Texas where the work never really stopped. 3 months into dating, Marcus had brought Emma to the ranch for the first time. He'd shown her around, the barns, the pastures, the simple but comfortable house where he lived alone. He'd introduced her to his ranch hands, who'd all suddenly understood why their boss had been in such a good mood lately. And then he'd done something that had shocked her completely. He'd taken her hand in front of all of them and said, "Everyone, this is Emma. She's going to be part of our lives from now on. I'd appreciate it if you'd all treat her with respect." It wasn't quite a proposal, but it was something close, a public declaration that she mattered, that she belonged in his world. When he'd finally asked the actual question, on a warm evening in September, after a day spent working in his garden, surrounded by the plants Emma had helped him plant, he'd done it with such straightforward simplicity that it had felt like an extension of everything that had come before. "Emma, will you marry me?" "No ring yet," he'd explained. He wanted to pick it out with her, wanted her to have a say in something that was supposed to be about her as well as him. She'd said yes, and she'd cried, and Marcus had held her while the Texas sun set behind them. But on her wedding day, standing in the vestibule of Prairie View Baptist Church in a dress that had been altered 3 times to fit her frame, Emma had suddenly felt the weight of all those years of invisibility crash down on her at once. Her mother had finished helping with her veil and had stepped back to look at her daughter. Dorothy's eyes had filled with tears, but Emma had caught the flash of something else first: relief. Relief that her daughter had finally made it to this milestone. Relief that despite everything, Emma hadn't ended up alone. "You look beautiful," Dorothy had whispered. And Emma had known what she really meant. "You actually pulled this off." The church was packed. Almost everyone in Riverside was there, along with relatives from across the state and friends of Marcus's family. Emma had spotted Patricia Henning in the 3rd pew, and she'd watched Patricia's face as Emma walked down the aisle. There had been surprise there, and something else that Emma couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps, that the invisible girl had somehow become visible, but it was Marcus's face that had mattered. He'd been standing at the altar in a dark suit, and when he'd seen her, his expression had shifted into something so completely open and accepting that Emma had almost stumbled. There was no hesitation in him, no moment of second-guessing, no flash of doubt about what he was doing. As Emma joined him at the altar, Reverend Thomas had begun the familiar words, but Emma found herself not fully hearing them. She was too aware of Marcus's hand in hers, of the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the church. And in that moment, standing before God and her entire community in a white dress, Emma understood something that would take years to fully process. This moment wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke or a mistake or a temporary aberration in the natural order of things. Marcus had chosen her, not despite her size, not in spite of it, not as a compromise or a settlement. He had looked at her and decided that this was what he wanted. Everything that came next, and there would be challenges, complications, moments of doubt and struggle, but everything that came next would be built on that foundation. She was worthy of love. She was worthy of being chosen, and that single truth, spoken not in words but in actions, would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first month of married life felt like living inside a dream that Emma was certain would shatter if she blinked too hard. She and Marcus had rented a small house on the edge of town while they planned renovations to his ranch house, a project that would take several months. The rental was modest but clean. With a kitchen that Emma had immediately begun to claim as her own, they'd settled into a rhythm quickly. Marcus would leave for the ranch at dawn, working until mid-afternoon during the slow season, then return home to a wife who often had dinner waiting. Emma had continued her job at the elementary school, though she'd begun thinking seriously about Marcus's question about doing her cooking full-time. Life should have been perfect. Instead, somewhere around week 3 of marriage, Emma had begun to notice something unsettling. The way Marcus's eyes would sometimes linger on her when she was eating. Not in a judgmental way, exactly, but in a way that felt like observation, assessment. It happened one evening when Emma had made her famous pecan pie for dessert. She'd cut herself a generous slice and was sitting across from Marcus at their small kitchen table, savoring the combination of sweetness and buttery crust, when she'd looked up and caught him watching her. "What?" she'd asked. Suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he'd said, but there had been something in his expression, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. That night, lying in bed next to her husband, Emma had felt the first small seed of doubt plant itself in her chest. It was irrational, she'd told herself. Marcus had chosen her. He loved her. He'd said so repeatedly. But that seed would grow, watered by small moments and unspoken tensions that neither of them quite knew how to address. The second month brought the comments, not from Marcus directly, but from other people, which somehow made them worse. It started with Marcus's mother, Sandra, who visited from her home in Dallas for a long weekend. Sandra was a thin woman in her early 60s. Carefully put together in the way wealthy Texas women often were. She'd always been gracious to Emma during their courtship, but there had always been a subtle quality to her graciousness, the tone of someone being nice despite circumstances. During Sandra's visit, Emma had prepared a home-cooked meal, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with garlic and herbs, fresh green beans, homemade rolls. It was one of her best efforts, and she'd been excited to show Marcus's mother what she could do. Sandra had eaten politely and had complimented the food in that particular way that made it clear the compliment was about effort rather than genuine enjoyment. But later, as Emma was clearing plates, Sandra had appeared in the kitchen and had said something that would replay in Emma's mind for weeks afterward. "You know, dear, now that Marcus is married, he might appreciate it if you didn't gain too much weight." Men have certain expectations, and it's important for wives to maintain themselves. For their marriages, Emma had stood frozen, plate in hand, trying to process what was being implied. The unspoken message was clear: you're already large. Don't get worse. Don't give him an excuse to regret his choice. Emma had wanted to respond. She'd wanted to say something sharp and clever that would make Sandra understand how inappropriate the comment was. Instead, she'd simply nodded and had finished clearing the dishes, feeling something inside her shift and harden. The comment had planted a new seed: worry. What if Marcus's mother was right? What if Marcus was already having second thoughts? What if she needed to prove her worth through physical transformation? Then 2 weeks later, Patricia Henning had appeared at the school during lunch break. Patricia taught 3rd grade and had always maintained a distant but friendly relationship with Emma. But something had changed, or Emma's perception of something had changed. "Emma, you look absolutely glowing," Patricia had said in the teacher's lounge, and there had been something in her tone that felt almost predatory. "Married life must agree with you. You seem even happier than usual." "Happy suits you," Patricia had continued, and this was the part that had stuck with Emma. "Though I have to say, Marcus is quite the romantic. I can't imagine how he manages it given, well, you know. But good for you for making it work." The implication had been unmistakable. It was surprising that a man like Marcus would be attracted to a woman like Emma. It was surprising that he'd made the effort to be romantic. It was surprising that it was working at all. Emma had smiled and had said nothing, but something inside her had begun to crack. By the 3rd month of marriage, Emma had begun to notice patterns in her own behavior that concerned her. She'd started paying more attention to what she ate. She'd begun exercising more, not because she actually enjoyed it, but because she felt like she should. She'd started wearing looser clothes, as if making herself smaller might somehow prevent the judgment she could feel hovering just outside her door. Marcus had noticed, though neither of them had talked about it directly. One evening, Emma was preparing dinner, a salad with grilled chicken, deliberately light and carefully portioned. Marcus had come into the kitchen and had looked at what she was making with an expression that was difficult to read. "That's all you're making?" he'd asked. "You don't like salad?" "I like salad fine. But this is dinner, right?" "Just salad. I thought it would be healthier." Marcus had set down his work bag and had looked at his wife directly. "Emma, did my mother say something to you?" The question had caught her off guard. She'd almost lied, almost brushed it off, but something in his tone had suggested he wouldn't accept that. "She mentioned that I should be careful about my weight. For the marriage." Her mother had finished helping with her veil and had stepped back to look at her daughter. Dorothy's eyes had filled with tears, but Emma had caught the flash of something else first: relief. Relief that her daughter had finally made it to this milestone. Relief that despite everything, Emma hadn't ended up alone. "You look beautiful," Dorothy had whispered. And Emma had known what she really meant. You actually pulled this off. The church was packed. Almost everyone in Riverside was there, along with relatives from across the state and friends of Marcus's family. Emma had spotted Patricia Henning in the 3rd pew, and she'd watched Patricia's face as Emma walked down the aisle. There had been surprise there, and something else that Emma couldn't quite name. Recognition, perhaps, that the invisible girl had somehow become visible. But it was Marcus's face that had mattered. He'd been standing at the altar in a dark suit, and when he'd seen her, his expression had shifted into something so completely open and accepting that Emma had almost stumbled. There was no hesitation in him, no moment of second-guessing, no flash of doubt about what he was doing. As Emma joined him at the altar, Reverend Thomas had begun the familiar words, but Emma found herself not fully hearing them. She was too aware of Marcus's hand in hers, of the way he was looking at her like she was the only person in the church. And in that moment, standing before God and her entire community in a white dress, Emma understood something that would take years to fully process. This moment wasn't an accident. It wasn't a fluke or a mistake or a temporary aberration in the natural order of things. Marcus had chosen her, not despite her size, not in spite of it, not as a compromise or a settlement. He had looked at her and decided that this was what he wanted, everything that came next, and there would be challenges, complications, moments of doubt and struggle, but everything that came next would be built on that foundation. She was worthy of love. She was worthy of being chosen, and that single truth, spoken not in words but in actions, would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first month of married life felt like living inside a dream that Emma was certain would shatter if she blinked too hard. She and Marcus had rented a small house on the edge of town while they planned renovations to his ranch house, a project that would take several months. The rental was modest but clean, with a kitchen that Emma had immediately begun to claim as her own. They'd settled into a rhythm quickly. Marcus would leave for the ranch at dawn, working until mid-afternoon during the slow season, then return home to a wife who often had dinner waiting. Emma had continued her job at the elementary school, though she'd begun thinking seriously about Marcus's question about doing her cooking full-time. Life should have been perfect. Instead, somewhere around week 3 of marriage, Emma had begun to notice something unsettling, the way Marcus's eyes would sometimes linger on her when she was eating. Not in a judgmental way exactly, but in a way that felt like observation, assessment. It happened one evening when Emma had made her famous pecan pie for dessert. She'd cut herself a generous slice and was sitting across from Marcus at their small kitchen table, savoring the combination of sweetness and buttery crust, when she'd looked up and caught him watching her. "What?" she'd asked. Suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he'd said, but there had been something in his expression, a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. That night, lying in bed next to her husband, Emma had felt the first small seed of doubt plant itself in her chest. It was irrational, she'd told herself. Marcus had chosen her. He loved her. He'd said so repeatedly, but that seed would grow, watered by small moments and unspoken tensions that neither of them quite knew how to address. The second month brought the comments. Not from Marcus directly, but from other people, which somehow made them worse. It started with Marcus's mother, Sandra, who visited from her home in Dallas for a long weekend. Sandra was a thin woman in her early 60s, carefully put together in the way wealthy Texas women often were. She'd always been gracious to Emma during their courtship, but there had always been a subtle quality to her graciousness, the tone of someone being nice despite circumstances. During Sandra's visit, Emma had prepared a home-cooked meal, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes with garlic and herbs, fresh green beans, homemade rolls. It was one of her best efforts, and she'd been excited to show Marcus's mother what she could do. Sandra had eaten politely and had complimented the food in that particular way that made it clear the compliment was about effort rather than genuine enjoyment. But later, as Emma was clearing plates, Sandra had appeared in the kitchen and had said something that would replay in Emma's mind for weeks afterward. "You know, dear, now that Marcus is married, he might appreciate it if you didn't gain too much weight. Men have certain expectations, and it's important for wives to maintain themselves. For their marriages." Emma had stood frozen, plate in hand, trying to process what was being implied. The unspoken message was clear. "You're already large. Don't get worse. Don't give him an excuse to regret his choice," Emma had wanted to respond. She'd wanted to say something sharp and clever that would make Sandra understand how inappropriate the comment was. Instead, she'd simply nodded and had finished clearing the dishes, feeling something inside her shift and harden. The comment had planted a new seed. Worry. What if Marcus's mother was right? What if Marcus was already having second thoughts? What if she needed to prove her worth through physical transformation? Then 2 weeks later, Patricia Henning had appeared at the school during lunch break. Patricia taught 3rd grade and had always maintained a distant but friendly relationship with Emma. But something had changed. Or Emma's perception of something had changed. "Emma, you look absolutely glowing," Patricia had said in the teacher's lounge, and there had been something in her tone that felt almost predatory. "Married life must agree with you. You seem even happier than usual. Happy suits you," Patricia had continued, and this was the part that had stuck with Emma, "though I have to say, Marcus is quite the romantic. I can't imagine how he manages it, given, well, you know. But good for you for making it work." The implication had been unmistakable. It was surprising that a man like Marcus would be attracted to a woman like Emma. It was surprising that he'd made the effort to be romantic. It was surprising that it was working at all. Emma had smiled and had said nothing. But something inside her had begun to crack. By the 3rd month of marriage, Emma had begun to notice patterns in her own behavior that concerned her. She'd started paying more attention to what she ate. She'd begun exercising more, not because she actually enjoyed it, but because she felt like she should. She'd started wearing looser clothes, as if making herself smaller might somehow prevent the judgment she could feel hovering just outside her door. Marcus had noticed, though neither of them had talked about it directly. One evening, Emma was preparing dinner, a salad with grilled chicken, deliberately light and carefully portioned. Marcus had come into the kitchen and had looked at what she was making with an expression that was difficult to read. "That's all you're making?" he'd asked. "You don't like salad?" "I like salad fine. But this is dinner, right? Just salad? I thought it would be healthier." Marcus had set down his work bag and had looked at his wife directly. "Emma, did my mother say something to you?" The question had caught her off guard. She'd almost lied, almost brushed it off, but something in his tone had suggested he wouldn't accept that. She mentioned that I should be careful about my weight. "For the marriage." Marcus had been quiet for a long moment, and then he'd done something Emma hadn't expected. He'd gotten angry. Not at her, but she could sense the anger radiating from him like heat. What exactly did she say? Emma had repeated Sandra's comments, feeling increasingly uncomfortable as she did. Saying the words aloud had made them sound worse somehow, more petty, more cruel, more designed to undermine. Marcus had run a hand through his hair. A gesture Emma was learning meant he was frustrated. "That's not okay, and it's not what I want for us. Emma, I married you. I married all of you. I didn't marry you with conditions about maintaining some arbitrary standard of appearance. But I want to look good for you," Emma had said. And even as the words came out, she'd recognized how pathetic they sounded, how much they revealed about where her mind had gone. "You do look good. You look like my wife. You look like the woman I chose. And I don't want you changing yourself based on what my mother thinks or what anyone else thinks. I want you being you." It had been a beautiful thing to say. It should have fixed everything. But Emma had felt the damage was already done, not by Marcus, but by the world's constant message about what bodies like hers were supposed to be worth. And she wasn't sure she believed him. Not completely. Not yet. 2 months into the marriage, Marcus had brought up the topic of Emma quitting her job at the school again, but this time it had been different. It hadn't been a casual suggestion, it had been a formal proposal. They'd been sitting on the porch of their rental, watching the sun set over Riverside, when Marcus had said, "I've been thinking about your cooking, about how much potential you have." "My cooking?" Emma had been surprised by the direction of the conversation. "You're wasting yourself at the school. I see how tired you are on Fridays, how you're managing 2 jobs, your actual job and the farmer's market. What if you didn't have to do that? What if you could focus on the cooking full time?" "I need the security of the school job," Emma had said automatically. "It has benefits, and it's stable. I provide stable income. You'd be secure with me." Emma had heard the offer underneath the words, dependence. She would become dependent on Marcus's income, his choices, his willingness to support her dreams. It was what women were supposed to do, wasn't it? What wives were supposed to do. But something in her had resisted the idea. "That's kind of you, but I need to keep the school job," she'd said. "At least for now." Maybe later, after I see if the cooking business can actually sustain itself as a full-time venture." Marcus hadn't pushed, but Emma had sensed his disappointment. Later, she'd realized that this moment had been important, that her resistance to being kept, to being completely dependent on her husband, had been an act of self-preservation she hadn't quite understood at the time. Summer arrived with heat and humidity, and with it came the social expectations that Emma hadn't anticipated. Being Mrs. Marcus Webb came with a social position she hadn't fully understood. As the wife of a moderately successful rancher, Emma was suddenly expected to participate in certain community activities. She was invited to the ladies' auxiliary at church. She was expected to join the country club. She was invited to brunches and charity events. At first, Emma had been thrilled. These were spaces she'd always existed on the periphery of, spaces where women like Patricia Henning naturally belonged. But as she began to participate more, she'd noticed something disturbing, the subtle ways she was still treated as an outsider. At a charity luncheon hosted by the country club, Emma had overheard a conversation in the ladies' room between two women she didn't know. "Can you believe Marcus Webb married Emma Hartley?" one had said, applying lipstick in the mirror. "I mean, she's nice enough, but she's so, well, large. I would have thought he'd want someone more conventional." "Love is blind," the other woman had replied, and they'd both laughed as if this were the most obvious explanation for Marcus's choice. As if love for someone like Emma could only be explained by some kind of vision impairment. Emma had stood in her stall, frozen, listening to herself being discussed as if she were a curiosity, a puzzle to be solved, an exception to the natural order of things. She'd finished in the bathroom and had returned to the luncheon, where she'd sat at a table with these same women and had smiled and had made small talk about decorating and children and the weather. No one had known that she'd heard them. No one had known that something in her had broken a little more. By the end of the 3rd month of marriage, the tension between Emma and Marcus had become impossible to ignore. It wasn't a dramatic tension. There were no fights, no raised voices. It was a quiet tension, made of unspoken hurts and small misunderstandings, and the weight of a world constantly telling Emma she shouldn't be where she was. Emma had begun spending more time in the kitchen, not because she loved it anymore, but because the kitchen was a place she understood. The kitchen was a place where she had power and control. In the kitchen, her size didn't matter. In the kitchen, her worth was measurable in the quality of the food she produced. One evening, after another long day at school followed by a farmer's market setup, Emma had come home exhausted. She'd made a simple dinner, pasta with marinara sauce and garlic bread. She'd sat down to eat and had found herself eating more than she normally would, driven by exhaustion and emotion and the simple need for comfort. Marcus had watched her eat, and Emma had seen that flicker of concern cross his face again. This time, instead of staying silent, she'd called him out. "What?" she'd demanded, setting down her fork. "What is that look?" "What look?" "That look you get when I'm eating. Like you're watching me, judging me." Marcus had set down his own fork slowly. "I'm not judging you." "Then what are you doing?" "I'm worried about you," he'd said, and his voice had been gentle but firm. "Emma, you're different since we got married. You're smaller. I mean, you're eating less, and you seem stressed and unhappy, and that's not what I want for us." Emma had felt tears burning in her eyes, and she hadn't bothered to hide them. "Your mother told me I needed to maintain my appearance. The women at the country club don't think I'm good enough for you. Patricia Henning implied that you having to be romantic with me is some kind of heroic act, and the world keeps telling me I'm not supposed to be here, that someone like me doesn't get to be married to someone like you, and I'm trying so hard to prove them wrong by being smaller and quieter and less visible than I already am." Marcus had stood up from the table and had walked around to where Emma was sitting. He'd knelt down beside her chair, taking her face in his hands. "Look at me," he'd said, and she'd raised her tear-stained face to meet his. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. Not my mother, not Patricia Henning, not the women at the country club. I care what you think, and I need you to know that I chose you exactly as you are. I didn't choose you despite your size. I chose you because you're brilliant and kind and talented and interesting." "But what if you change your mind?" Emma had whispered. "What if eventually you realize that the world is right and you made a mistake?" "I won't change my mind," he'd said, "but I'm starting to realize that the world has already changed yours for you. And I think we need to talk about that, because that's the real problem here. Not you, not your body, not anything about you. The real problem is that you've internalized all this judgment and you're trying to disappear." It was in that moment, kneeling on their kitchen floor, that Emma had understood something profound. The battle she was fighting wasn't against Marcus. It wasn't against his mother or Patricia Henning or the women at the country club. The battle was against herself, against the version of herself she'd been taught to believe was fundamentally not good enough. And that battle, she realized, was going to require a different kind of courage than simply accepting being chosen. It was going to require learning to choose herself. 2 days after the confrontation in the kitchen, Emma had called in sick to school. She'd spent the morning sitting in their rental house, wrapped in a blanket despite the summer heat, trying to sort through the emotional debris of her realization. The truth was, she didn't feel sick. She felt exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix. She felt like she'd spent the last 3 months running from something, only to discover that the thing she was running from was herself. Her phone had buzzed, with a text from an unexpected source. Martha Chen, who taught 4th grade at Riverside Elementary and was one of the few people at the school Emma might have considered an actual friend rather than just a colleague. "Hey, just heard you called in sick. You okay? Want some company? I have a free period at lunch." Emma had almost said no. Instead, she'd found herself saying yes. Martha had arrived with soup from the cafe down the street and had brought with her the kind of no-nonsense energy that Emma was discovering she desperately needed. Martha was in her mid-40s, never married, and carried herself with a confidence that had always slightly intimidated Emma. Martha didn't care what people thought. More importantly, Martha didn't seem to believe she needed to. "So what's going on?" Martha had asked, settling onto the couch with 2 bowls of soup. "And don't tell me it's stomach flu, because I saw you at the farmer's market last Saturday, and you looked like you'd been through something." Emma had hesitated, then had found herself telling Martha everything. About Sandra's comments, about the country club women, about the way she'd been slowly erasing herself since the wedding, about the fear that Marcus would eventually regret choosing her. Martha had listened without interrupting, eating her soup steadily, and when Emma had finished, Martha had set down her bowl and had looked at her directly. "Okay, so let me ask you something," Martha had said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer. What do you think is going to happen if you lose 50 pounds? I don't know. I guess I'd feel more confident, more like I belong. And who told you that you don't belong now?" "Everyone," Emma had said. "The world, society, people." "People," Martha had repeated. "You mean like Patricia Henning and your mother-in-law and the women at the country club? Because I've got to tell you, Emma, those people aren't the arbiters of truth. They're just people with opinions, and most of their opinions are based on fear. Fear of what? Fear of women who don't fit the mold. Fear of men who choose women based on substance rather than appearance. Fear that their own narrow understanding of the world might be incomplete." Martha had picked her soup back up. "My mother spent 40 years of her life trying to be what she thought she should be. She dieted, she exercised, she wore the right clothes, she said the right things. And you know what happened? She never felt like she was enough, and she died without ever realizing that the problem wasn't her. The problem was that she'd given her power to people who didn't deserve it." Emma had felt something shift in her chest. So you're saying I shouldn't care what anyone thinks? I'm saying you should care what you think, and maybe care what your husband thinks, since he's actively chosen to spend his life with you. But everyone else, they're extras in your story, not the main characters. The following Monday, Emma had made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Miller, the only female physician in Riverside, and someone Emma had always admired from a distance. Emma had been to see Dr. Miller for routine checkups and had always left thinking that here was a woman who seemed completely comfortable in her own skin. Emma had sat in the examination room after her checkup and had asked a question that had been bothering her. "Dr. Miller, do you think I should try to lose weight?" Dr. Miller had looked up from her notes and had studied Emma over the top of her glasses. "Why would you ask me that?" "Because, well, I'm overweight, and I've heard that it's not healthy, and since I got married I've been thinking about it more, and Emma, your blood pressure is normal. Your cholesterol levels are good. You're not diabetic. You exercise regularly. You eat reasonably well. By every medical metric, you're healthy." Dr. Miller had set down her clipboard. "So I'm going to ask again, why would you want to lose weight?" "Because I'm not supposed to look like this," Emma had said, and hearing herself say it aloud had made her realize how ridiculous it sounded. "According to whom?" "Everyone, everyone," Dr. Miller had repeated, and she'd stood up and had walked to a chart on the wall showing body types and health markers. "You know what I learned in medical school? Health doesn't come in a specific dress size. Some of my healthiest patients are larger. Some of my unhealthiest are thin. There's no magic number on a scale that determines your worth, or your health, or your right to exist in the world." Dr. Miller had turned back to face Emma. "I'm going to tell you something that nobody told me, and I wish someone had. You have one body. One. You can spend your life hating it and trying to change it into something it's not naturally inclined to be, or you can spend your life taking care of it and actually enjoying being alive in it. Those are your two real options. Everything else is noise." By late July, Emma had begun to shift her thinking, though not without resistance. She was still fighting against years of conditioning, still struggling against the voice in her head that said she should be smaller, quieter, less. But she was starting to recognize that voice for what it was, not truth, but programming. It was in this space of gradual awakening that an unexpected opportunity had appeared. Jennifer Walsh, who owned the Walsh Hotel in downtown Riverside, had tracked Emma down at the farmer's market and had made her an offer. Jennifer was a woman in her 50s who'd inherited the hotel from her parents and had been gradually updating it. The hotel had a small restaurant space that had been closed for the past year. "I want to reopen it," Jennifer had told Emma, setting down a coffee and sitting across from her at the market table. "Not as a fine dining establishment. I want something that feels like home. Comfort food, made fresh, served with care. And I think you're the person to do it." Emma had been stunned. "Jennifer, I'm not a chef. I don't have formal training. I'm not asking for formal training. I'm asking for what you do naturally. I want your cornbread in my restaurant. I want your biscuits and gravy for breakfast. I want people coming in and feeling like they're being fed by someone who actually cares about them." Jennifer had leaned forward. "I know about your farmer's market reputation. I know people drive from 2 towns over just to buy your bread. That's not luck, Emma. That's talent and care. I want to invest in that." The offer had terrified Emma. It had also thrilled her. She'd mentioned it to Marcus that evening, cautiously, as if afraid he would discourage her. Instead, he'd immediately started asking questions about budget and timeline and what she would need to get started. When she'd finished explaining, he'd reached across the dinner table and had taken her hand. "I think you should do it," he'd said simply. "I think you should quit the school job and do this, full time." "I was going to keep the school job," Emma had said. "For security. You don't need the school job for security. You have me, and you have the farmer's market income, and now you have Jennifer offering you a real business opportunity. Emma, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Not teaching other people's children, creating things that bring joy to people." It wasn't said unkindly, but Emma had felt a flicker of defensiveness. "I love working with the children. I know you do. But is that where your real passion is? Or is that where you've settled because it felt safe? The question had struck deeper than Marcus had probably intended. Emma had spent her whole life settling for things that felt safe, for friendship instead of love, for being useful instead of being valued, for smallness instead of taking up space. Section 3D, the family dinner at the end of July. Sandra had called and had insisted on coming back to Riverside for a family dinner. Emma had felt her old anxiety return immediately. The fear that this dinner would somehow undo the progress she'd been making towards self-acceptance. Emma had spent the 3 days before Sandra's arrival in a peculiar state of limbo. Part of her wanted to lose weight quickly, to show up smaller and more acceptable. Part of her was actively resisting that urge. The result was that she'd done nothing, and she'd felt guilty about it. The dinner was at the newly renovated house on the ranch, which Emma and Marcus had finally moved into the week before. It was beautiful, larger than Emma had expected, with a modern kitchen that made her heart sing. She'd prepared the meal herself, roasted beef, potatoes with herbs, fresh vegetables, and her signature biscuits. Sandra had arrived looking elegant and disapproving in equal measure. She'd hugged Emma, and Emma had felt the micro-assessment happening, the way Sandra's eyes had moved across her body, as if checking whether the weight problem had been resolved. At dinner, Sandra had made various comments. Some were about the food, backhanded compliments about managing to eat well despite everything. Others were about Emma's appearance, suggesting that she looked fresher than the last time they'd met, which Emma suspected was code for thinner, whether or not it was actually true. But halfway through the meal, Marcus had set down his fork and had done something Emma hadn't expected. He'd addressed his mother directly. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something. I've noticed that you make a lot of comments about Emma's appearance and her weight, and I need to be clear. I don't appreciate it. Emma is my wife, and I chose her exactly as she is. These comments, they're inappropriate, and they need to stop." Sandra had looked shocked. "I was only trying to help, to make sure you have a happy marriage. A happy marriage doesn't come from me criticizing my wife's body or from outside pressure. It comes from accepting each other as we are." Marcus had glanced at Emma. "And for the record, I think my wife is beautiful, and I'm not interested in her changing to meet anyone else's expectations, including yours." The table had gone quiet. Sandra had set down her fork, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. She'd made some excuse about being tired, and had excused herself from the table. After she'd gone, Emma had looked at Marcus across the table, and something had shifted between them. Not the resolution of all their tension, that would take time and ongoing work, but something important, an acknowledgement that he was choosing her, actively and consistently, against the world's judgment. Section 3E, the decision in August. With Jennifer's offer sitting in the forefront of her mind, Emma had made her decision. She was going to leave the school job. She was going to take the restaurant opportunity. She was going to stop trying to be small and acceptable, and instead was going to try being visible and genuine. She'd given notice to the school, effective at the end of the semester. She'd negotiated a lease on the restaurant space with Jennifer, with terms that allowed Emma to maintain creative control and a reasonable profit share. She'd begun planning the menu, designing the space, ordering equipment, and most importantly, she'd stopped trying to disappear. She'd worn a dress to the country club that she loved, a dress that fit her properly, rather than trying to hide her body. She'd eaten what she wanted at meals. She'd spoken up in conversations instead of staying quiet. She'd begun in small ways to take up the space she'd always been afraid to occupy. One evening in late August, as she and Marcus sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the sunset, Emma had said something she wasn't sure she believed yet, but was beginning to understand might be true. "I think I've been angry at you," she'd said. "Not because of anything you did, but because you made me feel like I was supposed to be grateful for being chosen." Like being chosen was enough? Marcus had been quiet for a moment. "And now? Now I'm starting to think that choosing myself might matter more. That I can be grateful for you choosing me and also be proud of myself for building a life I actually want." Emma had paused. "Does that make sense?" "It makes perfect sense," Marcus had said. "And for what it's worth, I think you choosing yourself is incredibly attractive. More attractive than any diet or appearance change could ever be." In September, with the restaurant still under construction and Emma fully committed to the venture, something unexpected had happened. A local news station had picked up the story. The woman who'd been told her size made her unmarriageable had opened a restaurant. The headline had been, "From farmer's market to fine dining, Emma's kitchen opens in Riverside." Emma had been mortified by the attention, but Marcus had pointed out something she'd missed. The story wasn't playing her size as a tragedy or a triumph over adversity. It was playing her talent as the main story, her cooking, her vision, her courage in launching a business. The restaurant had opened on a Friday in late September, and the line out the door had started before they'd even officially unlocked. People from Riverside, from neighboring towns, from 3 counties over had come to try the food. Patricia Henning had come during lunch, and Emma had watched with quiet satisfaction as Patricia had eaten one of Emma's biscuits and had closed her eyes in genuine appreciation. That evening, Patricia had posted about the restaurant on the town's social media page, calling it a hidden gem and an absolute must-try. The irony wasn't lost on Emma. The same woman who'd made veiled insults about Emma's marriage was now publicly endorsing her business. But instead of feeling triumphant, Emma had felt something more interesting. She'd felt nothing. The approval she'd once craved no longer held the power to validate her. She was building something real, something that was hers, and that was validation enough. By November, Emma's Kitchen had become the unexpected success story of Riverside. What had started as a small restaurant venture in a hotel had evolved into something far more significant. Customers weren't just coming for nostalgia or the novelty of the story. They were coming because the food was genuinely exceptional, and the experience of eating there was transformative in ways that most people couldn't quite articulate. Emma had hired a small team, 2 kitchen assistants, a front-of-house manager named David, and a part-time server. The team had quickly developed a rhythm, and Emma had discovered she had a genuine talent, not just for cooking, but for managing people and running a business. She understood food costs and inventory management with a natural intuition that surprised even her. The success had brought unexpected consequences. Food. Critics from Austin had made the drive to Riverside and had written reviews that had positioned Emma's Kitchen as a destination dining experience. One reviewer had written, "What Emma Hartley has created transcends simple comfort food. This is cooking that remembers who you are, that honors tradition while respecting innovation. This is love expressed through flavor." The review had been published in a statewide magazine, and suddenly Emma's Kitchen was getting reservations from Houston and Dallas. Jennifer Walsh had approached Emma about expanding, maybe opening a second location, maybe even developing a catering arm of the business. It should have been thrilling. Instead, it was creating a problem that Emma hadn't anticipated. As Emma's business had grown, her marriage had begun to experience a different kind of strain. Not the kind that came from external judgment or Marcus's insecurity, but from something more subtle, the simple fact that she was no longer always available. Marcus had gotten used to having a wife who came home and made dinner. Marcus had gotten used to being the center of Emma's universe. Now, Emma was building something of her own, and that something required long hours, late nights, and an emotional investment that didn't always leave energy for their relationship. One evening in early November, Marcus had arrived at the restaurant unannounced during the dinner service. Emma had been in the kitchen, focused on timing a complicated order for a table of 12. She'd seen him standing in the doorway and had felt her stomach tighten. They didn't talk until after service ended, at nearly 11 o'clock. Emma had been exhausted, covered in flour and sweat, mentally reviewing the evening to see what could be improved. "Hi," Marcus had said. and there had been something in his tone that had immediately put her on alert. "Hi, what are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing." "It's 11 at night, Emma. You've been here since 4 in the afternoon. It's a Friday." "Friday is always busy. I know it's Friday. That's why I came to see my wife. We haven't had dinner together in almost 2 weeks. The accusation had stung, particularly because it was true. Emma had been so consumed with the launch and the initial success that she had neglected the domestic rhythms of her marriage. But instead of acknowledging that, she'd responded defensively. "Marcus, I'm building something here. This is important. I know it's important. But so am I, aren't I?" They'd driven home in separate cars and had not spoken for 3 days after that encounter. It was different from their earlier conflicts, which had at least been about something they could address. This conflict was about competing needs, and Emma wasn't sure how to resolve it. She'd tried reaching out on the 3rd day, suggesting they talk. They'd sat in their living room with coffee, and Marcus had finally articulated what had been bothering him. "I feel like I'm losing you," he'd said. "I know that sounds dramatic, but it's true. When we first got married, you needed me. I was the one who believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself. I was the one who saw your potential, and now I'm the one who sees my potential," Emma had said, not unkindly. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" "It would be if it meant I was still part of your life. But it feels like I'm becoming an obstacle to your success instead of a partner in it," Emma had wanted to argue. She'd wanted to point out that she'd never asked him to be her savior, that his belief in her was wonderful but shouldn't be the foundation of their entire relationship. But she'd recognized something important. Marcus was hurting, and his hurt was coming from a legitimate place. "I'm sorry," she'd said. "I haven't been a good wife these past few months." "I don't want you to be a good wife," Marcus had replied. "I want you to be present. I want our marriage to matter as much as your restaurant. It does matter, does it? Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like you'd be fine if I disappeared tomorrow. You'd keep building your empire, and you wouldn't miss me at all." The words had hurt because there was a grain of truth in them. Emma had built enough of her own foundation that she no longer needed Marcus for survival or validation. And while that was a victory in terms of her independence, it had apparently come at a cost to their marriage. The next day, Emma had found herself sitting in Jennifer Walsh's office, ostensibly to discuss expansion plans. But what had actually happened was that she'd broken down and had told Jennifer about the conflict with Marcus. Jennifer had listened patiently, then had set down her coffee and had shared something personal. "I was married once," Jennifer had said, "to a man who was wonderful and supportive while I was struggling. My parents had just died, and I was lost, and he was the thing that kept me grounded. I was so grateful to him that I structured my entire life around proving that gratitude." Jennifer had paused, looking out her office window toward downtown Riverside. "When I finally started running the hotel successfully, when I started building something that was mine, he felt threatened. He'd gotten used to being the strong one, the one who had it figured out. Suddenly I had my own strength, and he didn't know how to handle it." "What happened?" Emma had asked. "We got divorced, because I wasn't willing to stay small to make him comfortable, and he wasn't willing to grow to meet me where I was going." Jennifer had turned back to Emma. "I'm telling you this not to scare you, but to give you information. You've built something real here. You've discovered capabilities you didn't know you had. That's not something you should apologize for or minimize. But your marriage requires attention too. The question is whether Marcus can grow with you or whether he's going to ask you to stop growing to stay comfortable." A week later, something unexpected had happened. Marcus had come to the restaurant during the lunch service, which was unusual. He'd asked to speak with Emma in the office, away from the kitchen. "I have a proposal," he'd said, and Emma's first thought had been that he was going to ask for a divorce. Instead, he'd said, "I've been thinking about what you said about being a good wife and about my reaction to your success. And I've realized that I've been thinking about this all wrong." Marcus had pulled out a folder. Inside were business plans. Detailed business plans for expanding Emma's kitchen, for developing a catering operation, for eventually opening a second location. "I want to go into business with you," Marcus had said. "Not because I don't think you can do it alone. You obviously can. But because I don't want to be separate from what you're building. I want to be part of it. The ranch is doing well enough that I can hire a manager to handle the day-to-day operations. I could focus on the business side of the restaurant, the expansion, the catering, the logistics. You focus on what you do best, creating the food and the experience." Emma had stared at the papers in shock. "You'd leave the ranch?" "I wouldn't leave it. I'd delegate it. There's a difference. And honestly, I'm tired of ranching. I've been doing it my whole life because it's what I was supposed to do. But watching you discover what you actually want to do, that's inspired me to think about what I actually want." "What do you want?" Emma had asked carefully. "I want to build something with you. I want to be part of your success, not a bystander to it. I want our marriage to be a partnership where we're both growing, not where one of us is sacrificing so the other can shine." The conversation with Marcus had forced Emma to examine something uncomfortable. She'd been so focused on escaping her old identity as the invisible girl that she hadn't fully considered what she might owe to the people who'd loved her during that phase. She'd spent an evening alone, journaling in a way she hadn't done since high school, trying to sort through her emotions. What she discovered was complicated. She was angry, not at Marcus, but at the version of herself that had made her vulnerable to needing him in the first place. She was angry at the world for making her feel like being chosen was such a rare and precious thing that she should be grateful regardless of the cost. She was angry at all the years she'd spent trying to disappear, but underneath the anger was something else, gratitude, real complicated gratitude. Because Marcus had shown up for her when she didn't believe in herself. He'd seen her potential when she couldn't see it. And while she'd needed to learn to see herself, that didn't mean his early faith in her hadn't mattered. It had mattered enormously. Emma had called Marcus and had asked him to come to the restaurant after closing. They'd sat in the empty dining room, and Emma had apologized, not for her success, but for making him feel like their relationship was secondary to it. "You weren't wrong," she'd said. "I was starting to treat you like an obstacle. I was so focused on proving that I could do this alone, that I forgot you were supposed to be my partner, not my competition." Marcus had reached across the table and had taken her hand. "And I was so focused on feeling necessary that I didn't give you space to become independent. I think we both got some things wrong. So where do we go from here?" Emma had asked. "We build something together," Marcus had said. "Not as rescuer and rescued, not as two people trying to prove something to the world. Just as two people who actually want to be married to each other." By early December, Emma and Marcus had officially formed a partnership. Marcus had brought his business acumen to bear on the restaurant's growth. He'd negotiated better terms with suppliers, had created a systems manual that allowed them to maintain quality even as they expanded, had started preliminary work on securing a location for a second restaurant. More importantly, they'd both made conscious choices about their relationship. They'd established a rhythm. Tuesday nights were sacred. They'd leave the restaurant by 8 and would spend time together, whether that meant cooking at home, going on dates, or simply talking about life. They'd agreed to share business decisions, which meant Emma was learning more about the financial side of things, and Marcus was learning more about food and hospitality. But perhaps most importantly, Emma had stopped measuring her worth by how much she was needed. She'd stopped feeling like she had to prove her value through constant productivity. She'd started understanding that she could be successful and also be a good wife, that she could be independent and also be in a partnership, that she could take up space without apologizing for it. One evening, as they were closing up the restaurant together, doing inventory side by side, Marcus had said something that struck Emma as profound in its simplicity. "You know what I love most about you now?" he'd asked. "What?" "That you're not grateful anymore. You're happy. There's a difference. Grateful means you think you got something you didn't deserve. Happy means you know you deserve good things and you're enjoying them." Emma had stopped what she was doing and had looked at her husband. When did you get so smart? I've always been smart, he'd said with a grin. I just got better at listening. By mid-January, Emma's kitchen had been operating for 4 months, with remarkable success. The reservation list was booked 3 weeks out, and Jennifer had signed off on plans to open a second location in nearby Austin, a significant expansion. That would require Emma's direct involvement during the development phase. It was during a routine inventory check that Emma had discovered the first sign of trouble. David, her front-of-house manager, had been acting strangely for the past week. He'd been unusually quiet, and his usual enthusiasm about customer interactions had diminished noticeably. Emma had assumed he was simply tired, but when she'd pulled him aside to ask if everything was okay, he'd seemed reluctant to talk. "It's nothing," he'd said, avoiding eye contact. "Just some stuff happening outside of work." Emma had let it go initially, but the next day she'd received an anonymous email that changed everything. The email contained screenshots of social media posts, all from the past few months, all critical of Emma's kitchen. But they weren't the usual criticism about food or service. They were personal attacks. One post read, "Wonder how long it'll take people to realize that Ducker's Emma's kitchen is just marketing a narrative. Ordinary girl becomes extraordinary, please. She married a rancher and got bankrolled. That's not a success story. That's privilege." Another, "So tired of the big girl made good narrative. She's not inspiring. She's just rich now and finally getting validation. Nothing special about that." A third, "The food is fine but the story is manufactured." Trust me, Emma had felt her stomach drop. She'd recognized the pattern of the criticism. It was the kind of thing that came from someone who knew her story, and was actively trying to undermine her narrative. She'd confronted David directly about it that afternoon, and after some hesitation, he'd admitted the truth. He'd been posting the criticism. Not anonymously, but through various accounts he'd created. He'd been doing it because he was angry. In his office, with the door closed, David had finally explained himself. And Emma had discovered a conflict she hadn't anticipated. "I went to high school with you," David had said, his voice tight with years of accumulated resentment. "I watched you for years. You were always there, in the background, the girl everyone was nice to but no one actually wanted. And I watched you accept that. I watched you shrink yourself, and it was depressing, honestly. It made me sad to see you give up on yourself like that." Emma had listened, uncertain where this was going. "But then Marcus Webb shows up," David had continued, "and suddenly you're special. Suddenly you're getting married and opening restaurants and getting magazine reviews. Suddenly you matter. And it's not because you changed or because you developed new skills. It's because a man decided you were worth something. That's not fair," Emma had said. "I did develop new skills. I worked incredibly hard." "I know," David had interrupted, "which is exactly why it's so infuriating. You had those skills all along. You always had everything you needed to be successful. But you didn't believe in yourself until a man told you that you should. And now you're being celebrated for that transformation like it's some kind of inspiration, when really, it's just sad. It's sad that you needed external validation to become who you already were." Emma had sat back in her chair trying to process what David was saying. Because underneath the bitterness and the resentment, there was something true. She had needed external validation. She had allowed herself to be invisible until someone made her visible. And now she was benefiting from being celebrated for that story. "So what were you trying to accomplish?" Emma had asked. "By posting those things?" "I don't know. Burst your bubble, I guess. Make people see that the story isn't as inspiring as everyone thinks it is. Make them question whether you deserve the success you're getting." Emma had made the decision to fire David the same day, not out of anger, but because she couldn't employ someone who was actively working to undermine her business and her credibility. But firing him had forced her to confront something uncomfortable. He wasn't entirely wrong. She'd called Martha that evening and had asked to meet. They'd sat at a coffee shop outside of Riverside. Emma had wanted distance from potential observers, and Emma had shared what David had said. "He's right about some of it," Emma had admitted. I didn't believe in myself until Marcus believed in me. I was invisible until he made me visible. And now I'm being treated like some kind of inspiration story, when really I'm just a woman who needed a man to validate her." Martha had set down her coffee and had looked at Emma directly. "Okay, let's break this down. One, yes, you needed external validation. You know why? Because you lived in an environment that had systematically convinced you that you weren't worthy. That's not a character flaw. That's a reasonable response to an abusive culture. Two, Marcus did help you. That's also not a character flaw. People are social creatures. We often need other people to help us see what we can't see in ourselves. That's called being human." Martha had leaned forward. "Three, the fact that Marcus believed in you didn't create your talent. Your talent existed independently of his belief. What his belief did was give you permission to act on your talent. And four, and this is important, you have since grown beyond needing his belief. You're building something real. You've developed business skills. You're making decisions that are separate from his input. You're becoming the woman you need to be for yourself, not just for him." Martha had paused. "Here's the real question. Do you believe in yourself now?" Emma had thought about it. "I'm starting to, yes." "Then David's right that the narrative needs to be more complicated. But he's wrong that it's not inspiring. It's actually more inspiring because it's honest. This isn't a story about a man saving a woman. It's a story about a woman learning to save herself. Marcus was helpful, but you're doing the actual work. Those are two different things." News of David's firing had spread through Riverside quickly, as things did in small towns. But before people could fully process what had happened, Emma had decided to take a different approach than letting the rumor mill decide the narrative. She'd called a community meeting at the restaurant. She'd invited everyone who'd supported her: Martha, Jennifer, Dr. Miller, even Reverend Johnson from the church. She'd also invited the people who'd been skeptical, including Patricia Henning and some of the country club women, standing in front of approximately 40 people on a Tuesday evening. Emma had decided to be radically honest about her journey. "I want to talk about the narrative around my success," she'd said, "because I've realized that the story people tell themselves about my life isn't entirely accurate. And I think that's important to address." She'd explained her years of invisibility. She talked about how she'd internalized the world's judgment of her body and her worth. She'd explained how Marcus coming into her life had shifted something, not because he was a savior, but because he was the first person who'd looked at her and hadn't seemed to be calculating whether she was worth the effort. "But here's what's important," Emma had said. "Marcus believing in me didn't give me talent. It gave me permission. And I think that's actually the more interesting story. Because what I've realized is that so many of us are waiting for someone to give us permission. We're waiting for someone to tell us we're worthy. We're waiting for someone to choose us." Emma had looked around the room. "And sometimes someone does show up and give us that permission. But the real work starts after that. Because then we have to actually choose ourselves. We have to believe in ourselves. We have to do the work. And that part is all us." She'd talked about David's criticism and what had been true about it. She'd talked about the privilege of having a supportive partner, which was something not everyone had. She talked about the ways her story had been simplified into something more inspirational than truthful. "So I want to complicate the narrative," she'd said, "because I think the truth is more interesting than the story. The truth is that I'm a woman who was raised in a culture that taught her she wasn't worthy. The truth is that someone loved me anyway, which helped me start to question that teaching. The truth is that I worked incredibly hard to build something real. The truth is that I'm still figuring out who I am and what I actually want. And the truth is that all of that is ongoing. I'm not done growing. I'm not done changing. This isn't the end of the story. It's somewhere in the middle." The response had been varied. Some people had seemed uncomfortable with Emma's honesty. They'd wanted the simplified narrative of triumph over adversity, but others had responded differently. Patricia Henning had approached Emma afterward and had done something unexpected. She'd apologized. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." Patricia had told her, about living in a culture that teaches women they're not worthy. I think I've been part of that culture. I think I've been so focused on fitting into a narrow definition of acceptable that I've spent years making other women feel small to make myself feel like I was doing something right." Patricia had paused. "I'm sorry for that." Emma had accepted the apology, not because she needed it to move forward, but because she recognized it as genuine growth on Patricia's part. More significantly, Emma had been approached by 3 other women who'd attended the meeting, women from various parts of Riverside who'd said something similar to what Patricia had said, but with their own variations. They'd all talked about the ways they'd been judged, the ways they'd judged themselves, the ways they were beginning to question those judgments. One woman, Rebecca, who worked at the bank, had shared her own story. She'd been told by her family that her weight made her unfit for marriage, and she'd spent 15 years single because she believed them. "Watching you," Rebecca had told Emma, "watching you just exist without apologizing for it. It's making me question everything I believed about myself." By February, as they prepared for the Austin location opening, Emma had made a decision about how she wanted to tell her story going forward. She wasn't going to hide the role Marcus played in her journey, but she wasn't going to let it overshadow her own agency either. She'd worked with a local journalist to create a more nuanced article about the business. The headline had read, "How Emma Hartley Built an Empire with Help and Against the Odds." The article had talked about her early dreams and her self-doubt. It had mentioned Marcus, but had contextualized his role as supportive rather than transformative. It had focused primarily on her business decisions, her growth and her vision for the future. Most importantly, it had included perspectives from other people. Martha on Emma's resilience, Dr. Miller on the connection between confidence and health outcomes, Jennifer on what it takes to build a successful business, and Marcus on what it means to be married to someone who's pursuing their own vision. But there was also a quote from Emma herself that she felt captured where she'd arrived. "I spent a lot of my life believing that I needed someone to choose me to have value. I've learned that value doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from choosing yourself. The man I married is wonderful, and I'm grateful for his support. But I'm not grateful because he saved me. I'm grateful because he saw something in me that helped me eventually see it in myself. And then I had to do the work of actually believing it." One night in late February, Emma and Marcus sat on the porch of their ranch house watching the winter stars. And Emma had asked him something she'd been wondering about for weeks. "Do you ever feel like you're not enough for me anymore?" she'd asked. "Like I've grown beyond what you can offer?" Marcus had considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he'd admitted, "because you're building something that's genuinely yours now. And part of me misses being the one who believed in you first. Part of me misses being necessary." But Emma had prompted, because she could tell there was more. "But I've realized that me being necessary isn't what makes a marriage work. What makes it work is me being present. And I can be present for your growth even if I'm not the catalyst for it anymore. In fact, that might be better. That might be more honest." Emma had reached over and had taken his hand. "I'm still grateful for what you did for me, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." "I know," Marcus had said, "and I'm grateful that you're becoming someone who doesn't need to be grateful anymore. That's growth for both of us." In early March, a week after the Austin location opening had been officially announced, Emma received an email that she almost deleted. The sender was someone named Sofia Rodriguez, and the subject line read, "I need your help." Sophia's message was straightforward but vulnerable. She was a 23-year-old woman from a town 40 miles away who'd spent her entire life being told she was too fat to matter. She'd read about Emma's journey in the local magazine and had reached out hoping Emma might be willing to mentor her, to help her figure out how to live a life that wasn't defined by her body or others' judgments. Emma's first instinct had been to say no. She was busy with the business expansion. She didn't have time for mentoring. She wasn't qualified, but something had stopped her from hitting delete. Instead, She'd met Sophia for coffee on a Saturday morning. Sophia had shown up exactly on time, dressed carefully in clothes that seemed designed to minimize her body rather than celebrate it. She'd been nervous, apologetic for taking up Emma's time, and had spent the first 10 minutes explaining why she might not be worth Emma's effort. "Stop," Emma had said gently, after listening to Sophia apologize for her existence for several minutes. "You're doing what I did for 28 years. You're preemptively diminishing yourself so that other people don't have to do it for you. So let me ask you something. If I told you that you don't need to apologize, what would you want to say?" Sophia had seemed taken aback by the question. I don't know. No one's ever asked me what I want to say without apologizing first." "Well, what do you want?" Emma had asked. "Not what you think you should want. Not what you're supposed to want. What do you actually want?" What had started as a coffee meeting had evolved into an ongoing mentorship. Emma had started meeting with Sophia twice a week, once at the restaurant and once for something else, varying between hiking, cooking sessions, or simply having lunch together. Emma had discovered that she loved mentoring, not in an abstract way, but in the specific, practical way that came from having lived through what Sophia was experiencing. She could identify when Sophia was engaging in self-sabotage. She could recognize the moments when Sophia's confidence was wavering. She could offer not platitudes, but actual strategies for navigating a world that was actively hostile to women who looked like them. But more importantly, Emma had realized that mentoring Sophia was forcing her to examine her own journey in new ways. By explaining her reasoning and her choices to someone else, Emma had gained clarity about how far she'd actually come. 3 weeks into mentoring Sophia, Emma had suggested something unexpected. She'd asked Sophia to work at Emma's kitchen as a prep cook during the expansion phase. "I can't cook," Sophia had said immediately. "I don't have any experience." "Neither did I when I started," Emma had replied. "I learned because I had to, and because I loved it. I think you might love it too. At least I think you should try." Sophia had agreed tentatively and had started working at the restaurant the following week. The first few days had been chaotic. Sophia had made mistakes, had second-guessed herself constantly, had apologized more than seemed humanly possible for someone working a 15-hour week. But Emma had seen something important. When Sophia was focused on the actual work, on the precise knife cuts, the timing of cooking, the chemistry of flavors, she stopped worrying about whether she deserved to exist. The work had given her something to pour her insecurity into that eventually transformed that insecurity into competence. By the end of the first month, Sophia had become one of Emma's most reliable prep cooks. More importantly, she'd stopped apologizing for her presence. Emma hadn't anticipated that taking on Sophia would create a ripple effect. But it did. Rebecca, the bank employee who'd spoken to Emma after the community meeting, had approached her about investing in the business in a formal way. Rebecca had suggested that if Emma's kitchen was going to expand, they might want to consider whether there were funding opportunities through the bank that could support growth. The conversation had evolved into something more significant. Rebecca had proposed that Emma's kitchen consider becoming a training ground for women who were looking to rebuild their lives and their confidence. The concept had been Rebecca's idea, but it had resonated deeply with Emma. "What if," Rebecca had suggested during a meeting in Jennifer's office, "we created a formal internship program? Young women could come work at Emma's kitchen, learn a skill, build confidence, and have a space where their bodies don't define their worth. We could even offer some mentoring from you." Jennifer had liked the idea so much that she'd offered to fund it herself as part of her contribution to the business. Martha had volunteered to help with the curriculum and the selection process. Dr. Miller had offered to do a seminar on the health implications of body acceptance. Within 2 months, what had started as Emma mentoring one young woman had evolved into an actual program with structure and purpose. In June, Emma's Kitchen had officially launched its internship program, the Rising Voices Initiative. The first cohort consisted of 6 young women ranging in age from 20 to 32, all of whom had struggled with body image, confidence, or feelings of worthlessness. Each woman had a specific role within the restaurant. Some worked in food preparation. Others worked front of house. One, a young woman named Jasmine, had expressed an interest in business management and had worked directly with Marcus on operational decisions. What Emma had discovered was that the internship wasn't just about teaching culinary skills. It was about creating a culture where women could see themselves as valuable, regardless of their appearance. It was about showing them that their bodies didn't determine their worth, their potential, or their right to pursue ambition. Emma had instituted a practice that she'd found powerful. Every Monday, the interns would gather for what she called a story circle. Each woman would share something about her week, something she'd accomplished, something she'd struggled with, something she'd learned about herself. The focus was explicitly on growth, not on appearance or weight or conformity. Sophia, having completed her 3 months of informal mentoring, had been asked to stay on as an assistant manager, a role she'd accepted with genuine confidence rather than apologetic hesitation. "I don't know how to thank you," Sophia had told Emma after receiving the job offer. "2 months ago, I didn't believe I deserved to exist. Now I have a career path." "You always deserved to exist," Emma had said. "You just needed to be in a space where that deserving was acknowledged and reflected back to you." But the expansion of the program hadn't happened without cost. Emma was working even longer hours than before. She was emotionally invested in the success and well-being of 6 young women, in addition to running 2 restaurants. Marcus had noticed the strain, and they'd had to renegotiate their Tuesday night commitment several times. But instead of it being a point of conflict, Marcus had suggested something that had surprised Emma. He'd proposed that he'd take over most of the day-to-day management of the Riverside location so that Emma could focus on the Austin expansion and the internship program. "I know it's not what we planned," Marcus had explained, "but you're doing something important here. You're not just building a restaurant anymore, you're building a movement in a way, and that requires your direct attention more than it requires both of us spreading ourselves thin." Emma had been hesitant. "But what about our partnership? Wasn't that the whole point, building something together?" "It is," Marcus had agreed, "but building something together doesn't mean we have to do the exact same tasks. You're the visionary. I'm the operator. Let me do what I do best, so you can do what you do best." It had been a conversation that would have been impossible to have in the early months of their marriage. It required both of them to have grown beyond the need to prove something through their work. By July, Emma's kitchen had been featured in 3 major magazine articles and 1 television segment about entrepreneurs who were changing their communities. The Rising Voices initiative had attracted particular attention. One article had carried the headline, "From Invisible to Influential: How Emma Hartley Built an Empire and is Now Lifting Others." Another piece had focused specifically on the internship program and its impact on the women involved. The attention had been wonderful for business. Reservations had increased. Funding offers had come in for expansion. But it had also come with unexpected complications. Emma had been approached by a woman named Christine, who'd wanted to open a similar program in another state. Christine had been enthusiastic and well-meaning, but when Emma had asked her what her personal experience with body image had been, Christine hadn't had one. She'd wanted to replicate Emma's model because it seemed profitable and socially responsible, not because she had genuine investment in the cause. "I don't think that's going to work," Emma had told her as gently as possible. "The program works because it's grounded in authentic understanding. If you're just reproducing the structure without the foundation of lived experience, it's going to feel hollow, and the women in your program will sense that." The rejection had made Emma realize something important. The internship program wasn't a commodity that could be packaged and sold. It was a reflection of who Emma was and what she'd learned through her own journey. It couldn't be divorced from her authentic investment in it. This realization had made Emma more protective of the program's expansion. When Jennifer had suggested that they might franchise the concept, Emma had said no. "I understand it from a business perspective," Emma had explained to Jennifer and Marcus over dinner, "but something feels wrong about it. The program works because I know each woman in it. I know her story. I know what she's struggling with. I can see the shifts in her confidence. I can recognize when she's making progress. I can't do that at scale." Jennifer had been disappointed, but she'd understood. "So what does growth look like for the program then?" "I think," Emma had said. "Carefully, it looks like training other women to do what I'm doing. Not replicating my exact model, but helping them develop their own. Teaching them how to mentor, how to create culture, how to build something authentic for their communities." By August, a full year after opening Emma's kitchen, Emma had found herself in an unexpected position. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She wasn't fighting against her past or trying to overcome the world's judgment. She was simply building what she wanted to build in the way she wanted to build it. One evening, after the restaurant had closed and the interns had gone home, Emma had sat alone in the Austin location, which was still in the final stages of setup. She'd reflected on the journey, from the invisible girl at the farmer's market to the woman now building something that was helping others become visible. It was Sophia who'd found her there, doing some last-minute prep work. "You okay?" Sophia had asked, setting down her knife. "I'm just thinking about how strange life is," Emma had replied. "A year ago I didn't believe I deserved happiness. I didn't believe I deserved success. I didn't believe I deserved to take up space. And now," Sophia had prompted, "now I know that deserving isn't something I need to earn from other people. It's something I have simply by existing. And more importantly, I'm learning that the most powerful thing I can do is help other women understand that about themselves too." Sophia had smiled, and in that smile, Emma had seen her own journey reflected. Back to her, not because Sophia was becoming Emma, but because Sophia was becoming herself. "Thank you for that," Sophia had said simply. "You're welcome," Emma had replied, "and thank you for reminding me why this matters." By September, exactly 1 year after opening Emma's kitchen, the Riverside location had won a regional award for Best New Restaurant. The Austin location was operating at full capacity. The Rising Voices initiative had successfully graduated its first cohort of interns, with all 6 women remaining employed in various positions within the business or having moved on to other opportunities with genuine confidence in their abilities. Emma was 30 years old. She'd been thinking a lot about the concept of full circles, how life sometimes takes you back to where you started, but transformed by the journey. In her case, that transformation was literal. She was back in Riverside, the place where she'd grown up invisible, but she was no longer invisible. The town that had taught her she didn't matter now looked to her as a symbol of what was possible, but the award and the recognition meant something different to Emma now than it might have meant earlier in her journey. It wasn't validation that she'd been right to transform herself. It was acknowledgement that the work she was doing mattered to other people. Marcus had taken the afternoon off from running the restaurant to be at the award ceremony. He'd sat beside her as they'd announced the winner, and when they'd called Emma's name, he'd squeezed her hand. It was a small gesture, but it had contained so much. His pride, his support, his genuine happiness for her success, not as something he'd enabled, but as something she'd created. After the ceremony, at the celebration dinner, Emma had found herself standing with a group of people who'd been instrumental in her journey: Martha, Jennifer, Dr. Miller, Rebecca, and Sophia. They'd been laughing about something when Martha had raised her glass. To Emma, Martha had said, who taught us all that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is refuse to make yourself smaller. The group had raised their glasses, and Emma had felt something that she'd learned to recognize as genuine contentment. Not the desperate gratitude she'd felt a year ago, when she'd been fighting to prove she deserved to exist. Not the hunger for external validation that had once driven her. Just a quiet understanding that she'd built something real, and that something real was enough. But success had brought an unexpected complication, one that Emma hadn't fully anticipated. She'd been approached by a publisher about writing a memoir. The publisher had been enthusiastic about the marketability of the story, the invisible girl who became a success through love and determination. They'd wanted her to position the narrative around being saved by Marcus, around the transformative power of romantic love, around how choosing the right partner had changed everything. Emma had politely declined multiple times, but the publisher had been persistent. Finally, she'd agreed to a meeting, hoping to explain why she wasn't interested. "The story you're interested in," Emma had explained to the publisher, "is a story about rescue. And I appreciate that narrative appeal, I really do. But it's not accurate. Marcus didn't rescue me. Marcus loved me while I rescued myself. Those are profoundly different things." The publisher had leaned forward. "But that's less marketable. People want to believe in rescue. They want to believe that love can save you." "People want a lot of things," Emma had replied. "But I'm not going to tell a false story just because it's more marketable. Because here's what I know. There are women reading that story who are in situations where they're waiting for rescue. And if I tell them that rescue is possible through romantic love, I'm potentially keeping them trapped in situations where they're waiting for someone else to save them instead of learning to save themselves." Emma had stood up. "I won't do that. If you want to publish a book about my journey, it has to be honest about the complexity. It has to acknowledge that I had to do the work. It has to show that loving Marcus didn't fix me. Learning to love myself fixed me. And Marcus was helpful in that process, but he wasn't the mechanism. The publisher had decided to pass on the project." 3 weeks later, Emma had received a letter. The return address was from Seattle, and the handwriting was unfamiliar. When she'd opened it, she'd found a letter from a woman named Catherine, along with a photograph. Catherine had been 2 years ahead of Emma in high school. Emma barely remembered her. Catherine had been popular, beautiful, exactly the kind of girl who belonged to the world in ways Emma never had. But Catherine's letter had revealed something Emma hadn't known. "I've been following your story," Catherine's letter had read, "and I wanted to reach out because I think I owe you an apology. I was one of the people in high school who participated in the casual cruelty directed at you. I never said anything directly, but I laughed at jokes. I didn't include you. I let you be invisible. And I want you to know that I'm sorry." Catherine's letter had continued. "I'm writing now because I've spent 15 years building a life that looked perfect on the outside, the right job, the right house, the right marriage. But I've been miserable because I built that life based on what I thought I was supposed to want, not what I actually wanted. And watching you build a life based on what you genuinely cared about, watching you refuse to make yourself smaller to fit into other people's expectations, it's made me question everything." Catherine had signed the letter with her current name, she'd married, and taken her husband's name, and had included contact information. She'd written, "I'd like to apologize in person if you're ever in Seattle." No expectation of forgiveness, just a desire to acknowledge that I was part of a system that hurt you, and I'm trying to do better. Emma had read the letter several times. She'd felt anger at the reminder of the cruelty of her high school years, but she'd also felt something more complex, compassion for Catherine, who'd apparently spent years living a lie to fit an image. She'd written back. In her response, Emma had acknowledged Catherine's apology, but she'd also shared something that had been important for her to realize. The cruelty you and others directed at me didn't happen in a vacuum. We were all trapped in a system that demanded we be a certain way, look a certain way, want a certain way. You participated in that system, and yes, that hurt me. But you were also a victim of it, even if your victimization looked different than mine. I forgive you, not because what happened doesn't matter, but because I've learned that holding on to anger at the system and the people within it doesn't actually serve me. What serves me is building something different, a space where women don't have to hurt each other to survive. Emma had invited Catherine to visit Riverside when she could, and had offered to bring her into the Rising Voices Initiative network if Catherine was interested in that kind of community work. She'd ended with, "We can't go back and change high school, but maybe we can both build something better from here." On a Thursday evening in October, Emma and Marcus had finally had a conversation they'd been avoiding. The question of children. They'd been sitting in their backyard, watching the Texas sunset when Marcus had brought it up. "Have you thought about whether you want kids?" he'd asked. His tone casual, but his attention serious. Emma had considered the question. "Yes, I've thought about it, and my answer is, I don't know. Ask me in a few years?" Marcus had seemed surprised by her honesty. Most people wanted a clearer answer. "Why not now?" "Because I've spent my whole life making choices based on what I thought I was supposed to do. I'm still learning to make choices based on what I actually want. And right now, with the business, with the internship program, with all the growth happening, I genuinely don't know if what I want includes motherhood." Emma had paused. "I love working with the interns. I love being a mentor. I love helping women grow. But that's different from wanting to raise a child. And I'm not going to have a baby because it's the next logical step or because it's what wives are supposed to do. If I have a child, it's going to be because I genuinely, wholeheartedly want to be a mother." Marcus had reached over and had taken her hand. "I appreciate that. Honestly, I'm not sure I want biological children either. I've been thinking about whether we might adopt down the line, but I'm not in any hurry. I'm happy with where we are." It had been a conversation that would have been impossible in the early months of their marriage, when Emma had felt like she was supposed to give Marcus the family he'd earned through choosing her. Now it was a conversation between two equals about what they both wanted. Sandra had called in November with unexpected news. She was divorcing Emma's father. When Marcus had first told Emma about the call, Emma's initial reaction had been shock. In all her years of knowing Sandra, she'd never expressed unhappiness with her marriage. But over the course of a long phone conversation with Sandra, Emma had learned that Sandra had been quietly miserable for years. "I spent my whole marriage being who I thought I was supposed to be," Sandra had told Emma, "and I realized I don't actually know who I am beyond that. Your transformation scared me, Emma, because it forced me to look at my own life. And when I did, I realized I'd been living a lie." Sandra had come to Riverside for Thanksgiving, and instead of it being the uncomfortable visit that Emma had braced for, it had been surprisingly genuine. Sandra had asked to tour the restaurant and had asked serious questions about the business. She'd met the interns and had asked about their stories. She'd seemed genuinely interested in understanding what Emma had built, not from a place of judgment but from curiosity, over dinner. Sandra had said something that had moved Emma deeply. "I spent years trying to make you smaller so that I wouldn't have to confront how small I'd made myself. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for the comments about your weight, about your appearance. I was projecting my own insecurity onto you." Emma had accepted the apology and had found herself extending genuine compassion toward her mother-in-law. Sandra was on her own journey of self-discovery, just at a different point than Emma was. "What will you do next?" Emma had asked. "I'm honestly not sure," Sandra had admitted. "But for the first time in my life, I'm going to find out what I want before I decide what to do about it." By early December, Emma had reached a place that felt significant, though she couldn't quite articulate why until Martha had pointed it out. They'd been walking through Riverside's downtown, and Emma had stopped to look at her restaurant, the storefront that had once been empty, that she'd transformed into something beautiful and meaningful. Martha had asked what she was thinking about, I was just realizing, Emma had said, that I'm not angry anymore. I'm not fighting anymore. I'm not trying to prove something to the world. I'm just building, living, being, Martha had smiled. That's integration. That's when the internal work becomes so solid that you don't have to keep processing it. You've moved from healing to living. It feels strange, Emma had admitted. I was so focused on the transformation that I didn't know what would come after the transformation was complete. What comes after is the real work, Martha had said. The transformation gets all the attention because it's dramatic. But the real work is building a life that honors what you've learned. And that's what you're doing. As the year drew to a close, Emma had found herself reflecting on where she'd started. The invisible girl at the farmer's market. The woman who'd believed she didn't deserve love. The wife who'd tried to erase herself to prove she was worthy of being chosen. Now she was a woman who ran a successful business, a mentor to young women, a partner in an equal marriage, a woman who took up space without apology, a woman who believed, not because she'd been convinced by external validation, but because she'd done the internal work, that she mattered. On the one-year anniversary of opening Emma's kitchen, Emma had stood in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. The restaurant closed, just her and the space she'd created. She'd thought about the girl who'd believed no one marries a big girl except as a punchline or a failure to overcome. That girl had been wrong, not because Marcus had come along and rescued her, not because he'd made her visible or worthy, but because the moment he'd chosen her, it had given her permission to believe that maybe, just maybe, the world's judgment wasn't the final word on her value. And from that permission, she'd built everything else. She'd built confidence through competence. She'd built independence through work. She'd built community through authenticity. She'd built a legacy through service to others, and she'd learned something that no amount of external validation could have taught her. That the most powerful transformation isn't about changing yourself to fit the world's expectations. It's about changing the world's expectations by refusing to diminish yourself. Emma had walked through her restaurant one more time before closing up for the evening. She'd looked at the kitchen where she worked every day, at the dining room where strangers became community, at the office where she made decisions about the business, at the space where the rising voices interns learned that their bodies didn't determine their worth. And she'd understood, finally and completely, that the real success wasn't the restaurants, or the awards, or the media attention. The real success was standing in a space she'd created and feeling at home in herself. The real success was knowing that she belonged there, not because someone had chosen her, but because she'd chosen herself. And everything that had come after that choice, the love, the partnership, the business, the impact, the legacy, had only been possible because of that foundational act of self-selection. That was the story that mattered. That was the transformation that counted. And that was what she would spend the rest of her life living out and helping others discover. The Texas sunset over Riverside, casting the town in shades of gold and amber. Emma locked the restaurant door and headed home to Marcus, to the dinner she'd cook, to the marriage she was choosing every single day. Not because she had to, not because she was grateful, not because she was trying to prove something, simply because it was the life she wanted. And after spending so many years believing she didn't deserve to want anything, that was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.